welcome to the final session of our spring conference on the challenge of immigration at Yale Divinity School. I'm Harry Attridge, Dean of the school. This morning we'll be building on the conversations that we held yesterday where Luis Lugo gave us a presentation, a dramatic presentation about the projections for religious congregations in the future. We have seen how the American religious landscape is being reshaped by immigration. So today we ask the question, in light of these shifts, how do we adapt to these changes? How do religious communities better provide leadership in our churches, neighborhoods, and cities, as well as on the national scene? To lead us in this morning's conversation, I welcome a panel of religious professionals. Each serves the church addressing the challenge of immigrants in their various vocations and settings. I'll not read their extensive biographies, which are printed in your program. I'm delighted to welcome for this important conversation the Reverend Heidi Neumark, pastor of Trinity Lutheran Church in New York City, Pastor Samuel Rodriguez, president of the National Hispanic Christian Leadership Conference from Sacramento, California, the Reverend Daniel Romero, consultant to the Daniel F. Romero Border Ministry Center in San Ysidro, California, Bishop Peter Rosazza, Auxiliary Bishop and Vicar General for the Hispanic Apostolate in New Haven, Connecticut, Alejandro Siller, Pastoral Team Member of the Mexican American Cultural Center in San Antonio, Texas, and the Reverend Julia Thorne, Manager for Immigration Issues and Immigration Council of the Presbyterian Church USA in Louisville. The panel today will be ably moderated by Professor Harlon Dalton. Harlon is a senior professor at the law school and an Episcopal priest serving a parish in New Haven. For the last 2 years, we've been privileged to have him here on loan to us at the Divinity School, working with us on issues of religion and politics. It's with gratitude to all of the panelists that I now welcome you here, and I'll turn over the podium to Harlon.
Thanks, Harry. And I, too, will not give any biographies. We're going to simply dive in, though I will say that one of our panelists was at one point the state champion in the state YMCA champion in the 100-meter backstroke. So the quiz is to identify who is that panelist, who is, and if he or she will please raise his hand, Peter. You notice I referred to him as Peter. I could have referred to him as Bishop Rosazza or his most worshipful. But we, in fact, won't be using titles. I know that the one with the biggest title doesn't care, and it will just save us time. Let's begin with Heidi Neumark. Heidi, during your 19 years as pastor of Transfiguration Lutheran in the Bronx, did the church experience shifts in demographics? And if so, what impact did those changes have on parish life?
Yes, the church did experience shifts in demographics. The church was founded in the 1920s by immigrants from Puerto Rico. And in the 19 years that I was there, there were a lot of demographic shifts in the neighborhood. Partly there were an increase in African American members in the neighborhood. And in terms of the Latino population, it shifted from being almost entirely Puerto Rican to Dominicans, people from Ecuador, Honduras, and Guatemala. Those were the primary groups in that particular neighborhood. And then the church membership grew to reflect that shift in the neighborhood.
And so I'm sure visually it grew, but grew to reflect the shift. Did the actual lived religion shift? Did liturgy shift? Did
yes.
community life?
Yes. Well, in terms of the African American members in the neighborhood, we began worship in English. Actually, I mean, it kind of was the reverse from a lot. Certainly in our denomination, which, looking at the Pew study, is the whitest in the country. I was chagrined to notice.
Congratulations.
Yeah. So we began worship in English. And because there had been it was actually very fortunate, there had been no tradition of Anglo or white worship in English, so the worship was able to be shaped more profoundly by the African American people coming to the congregation. And we sought a musician who was African American who led that music. In Spanish, there was a huge change because the Puerto Ricans who founded the congregation came to the Lutheran Church through missionaries in Puerto Rico from Germany. In the 1800s, and the liturgy was basically the German or then English liturgy translated into Spanish. There was no attempt at being culturally sensitive, but then that really was the liturgical tradition of those people, because it had been the way they had worshipped for so many years, whereas the Latino people in the neighborhood were completely turned off by that. So the reality was it was a lot easier to be more creative in English worship because there was no tradition in the congregation. And then in the Spanish worship was where the staid group was. And there was also a class difference. The congregation that was there was a working class congregation who also had mostly moved out of the neighborhood, and the new people were very poor, and so there was slowly a complete really transition in terms of also age. It was an aging congregation. The neighborhood demographics were extremely young, and so there was change in age, in ethnicity, in music, in almost every way there were changes.
And did the influx from Central and South America change the Spanish language service over time?
Yes, completely. And then also we had monthly bilingual worship, because the idea was to be one congregation. People felt strongly about that, being one congregation with more than one language. There was also a large Garifuna community. The Honduran and Guatemalan people who came were mostly from the Garifuna community, which kind of retained its own culture and language. And sometimes we had some Garifuna worship.
And now you're in Manhattan on the Upper West Side
Yes.
at Trinity Lutheran. Mm-hmm. And if I understand correctly, when you came there was no Spanish language. It's been on your watch that the Latino congregation has grown?
Yes, before I came, there were social programs that were there were ESL classes, and there was an after-school program that were becoming increasing. Well, the ESL classes grew out of the need of parents in the after-school program, which was becoming increasingly Latino. And so when the church was seeking a new pastor, they wanted someone who could speak Spanish. And then, then we began worship in Spanish.
And would you say that there are two congregations, or one, or how does that? Just given that history.
There's one, but then that requires constant intentional work. The people didn't want to have a separate congregation in Spanish. So our church council, which is the leadership body of the church, because we now have that's bilingual, so that there can be representatives from the Latino community who have voice and vote, and that people don't speak English. So that makes the meetings go longer, and people have to be willing to put up with that and not see that as really to embrace that. But that's not easy. So that's been we don't have bilingual worship every month, but we have it about 9 or 10 times a year. And so then people, worship in each other's language. We have a bilingual children's choir that sings whenever we have bilingual worship. We have some of the, particularly some of the celebrations from Mexico. The people from Mexico are very happy to invite everybody. Some like El Día del Niño, Children's Day, and then all the children are invited, or the Guadalupe celebration. But it's still, each group really as a whole requires a different kind of, have different needs and different strategies of outreach and pastoral care, and so it is kind of like two congregations, but then there's also the work of people coming together. And we had to, for instance, have people, if they can't speak to each other, we sometimes have where one person who speaks no English and one person who speaks no Spanish, then one person who's bilingual, and then they have a three-way conversation to get to know each other. But that has to be, it doesn't just happen. It has to be intentionally organized.
A one-on-one with three.
A one-on-one with three, yes.
Just to let people know, by the way, I'm really dividing this up into two questions. One is, how has the religious landscape been reshaped by immigration? And that'll take up half of our time, roughly. And then the second question is, what is it that religious communities can bring to the table in terms of the immigration debate? So I'm going to ask questions of the panelists on the first question, and then open it to the floor about halfway through. And then the panelists will have another go around questions of immigration policy, and again open it. So instead of having to wait till the very end, you'll get 2 shots to be part of the conversation, just so you know. And we start at the parish level, but next is Julia Thorne, Presbyterian Church USA, who's the immigration diva, as I understand it, for the denomination, and also legal counsel. And I gather that you're called in by presbyteries and churches for a variety of reasons, but I'm curious about churches that seek your advice and counsel because they themselves are dealing with immigration within the church or the parish. What kinds of issues do they ask you about, or concerns do they raise with you?
Well, there are 2 levels. There's the our middle governing bodies level, and just who are our pastors. Our pastors have huge issues, and the immigration system is very, very difficult right now.
We say your pastor. Are you referring, for example, to Korean pastors, or?
I'm talking about pastors. I've had Scottish pastors are having trouble. We have Hungarian pastors who are having trouble. There's really no, under immigration law, the laws pertain to everyone, and being undocumented is being undocumented. So some of our pastors, we have quite a few undocumented pastors in our denomination, and I would say once every 2 months, one of our pastors who does have good immigration status somehow loses that. I've had 2 in the last 3 months who have lost status. One from going to an attorney who gave them wrong advice, and actually both of those included bad advice. Because even these are immigration attorneys who are giving bad advice, because the system is so complex. Even though the Lutherans and the Presbyterians and UCC, United Church of Christ, share pulpits, and pastors to immigration, they say, no, you have to be in the same denomination. So so immigration is informing who can be our pastors and who can't. We have problems with pastors can't work part-time. You can't be a student and be a pastor because your student visa doesn't allow you to work outside the school. So there are all kinds of situations that would be normal if you took away the immigration issue. If you took away immigration status, these would be normal things that pastors would be doing, and our immigration system is mucking up what we try to do as a church. Right now, if a pastor came to me, for instance, we have a Lebanese pastor who we are trying to call to a church in the Southwest. And it's going to the average right now, if I start today doing his paperwork, it would be a year from now that he would get permission to work. So what does a person do if they're not allowed to work in the United States and it's taking a year for them to get permission? It's very, very difficult. So that's on a pastoral level, and then on a congregational level, I was just in Denver meeting with some of our churches there, Our churches are, some of them 99% undocumented, depending on where you are in the United States. And we talked about possible reform of the laws. We talked about some of their personal situations. And at the end, they asked, where's the hope? I don't see any hope. Where's the hope? Where's the hope? And then there are churches, some of our churches that don't have immigrant congregations, they're asking, well, what's the church? You know, I hear this big issue out there. What is our church doing? What is our church stance? What are churches doing? What can we do? And so there are different levels. And then there's some churches that know one, like I'll get a phone call and it will be, we have this lovely young man from the Ukraine, and he has been in our church for 5 years, and he's paying his taxes, and he's a really nice young man. We want to sponsor him. And I have to say, you can't. That's not an option. And well, why not? And just trying to educate people about the system, that just because someone's nice and a member of your church, I heard an immigration attorney once call it pet aliens, where people kind of have this pet and they expect everybody to roll over and the government to do whatever they want to for this person, but they don't quite see it in the larger context that this is happening to millions of people, not just the person that they care about that's in their congregation.
Thank you. Peter Rosazza. How's the Roman Catholic Church in the United States been preparing itself for its increasingly Latino population? We saw the figures yesterday, just stunning. That's the first question. Yeah.
Okay. Interestingly, when Pope Benedict XVI spoke to us in private session, the first thing he emphasized was that we care for the newcomers, the immigrants, and therefore be true to our tradition. And I was very, very touched by that. I was a pastor for 10 years in the University Parish in Hartford, so I got that experience, and I've continued to relate. We have 24 parishes that serve Hispanics in the Archdiocese of Hartford, 3 counties, Hartford, New Haven, and Litchfield. And then the biggest second group of undocumented people are Polish. Interesting. New Britain, Connecticut has Sacred Heart Church. It's the biggest Polish Catholic community in the whole northeast of the United States. And there are many there who are undocumented. But on the national level, our United States Conference of Catholic Bishops has prepared this Justice for Immigrants program. You can access that on the website. It has a lot of useful materials, PowerPoint presentations, and so on. One of the slides, it says that more than half of the new jobs created between 1996 and 2003 are filled by foreign-born workers, and without immigrant workers there would be a worker shortage of 11 job categories, and so on. And we always realize, though, that what's done on the national level is supposed to help the parishes. There should never be a disconnect. It should be an effort that responds to the needs at the parish level. So, for instance, our Catholic bishops of the state of Connecticut wrote a pastoral statement. It was published yesterday. I have statements, copies for you. But amongst other things, it's to see the immigrant through the eyes of faith. We approach the issue of immigration with a focus on faith and human dignity. We refer to the parable of the Last Judgment when Jesus says, I was a stranger and you welcomed me. We call attention to the difficulty people have of uprooting themselves to go where there are risks and dangers. We state that there's no place in the Catholic family for racism, hatred of foreigners, exaggerated nationalism, and discrimination against immigrants. And the children of immigrants, many of whom are born in this country and have American citizenship, should not find themselves left alone and separated from their parents, or jailed or deported as part of an enforcement action. Citizens can and should press the government to temper its actions with mercy in order to reduce suffering and humanize public policy towards immigrants. And then we have a program on the national level that has, read a couple of points, an earned legalization program that allows undocumented persons to earn permanent residency, and a worker program that protects foreign-born workers and safeguards against the displacement of U.S. workers, and so on. Then I was for years on the Bishops' Committee for Hispanic Affairs, and we've had 3 encuentros through the years, and they become more and more Mexican, if you will, from this part of the country, although the Mexican reality was always the biggest for us. One in 1972, one in 1977, and then one in 1985, brought together all these communities and representatives through a whole process that had been designed by José Marins, who was Brazilian, an extraordinary pastoralist. So that gave the people a sense of cohesion, and out of that came a pastoral plan for Hispanic ministry for our parishes in the United States. Then, as far as our reality here, when I started in 1970 working with Hispanics, mostly Puerto Ricans, and there were smatterings of the other groups, but now, especially here in New Haven, from New Haven to Bridgeport up to Meriden, Wallingford, the Mexicans have become the largest group. In one of our parishes, Colombian 40%, Mexican 40%, maybe Ecuadorians 10%, and one of the parishes from which Fernandez Chavero from St. Rose, I think it's 18 countries from Latin America and 13 states of Mexico in the same parish. But the beauty there is of our Puerto Rican people, how they have been so open to receive the new folks. I mean, I really give them so much credit because they're the ones who founded our parishes generally. It's a struggle, and now especially we're struggling with the whole undocumented reality that before we didn't. We also have 2 Brazilian communities, one in Waterbury and one in Hartford, and one priest who serves both. And by the way, I just love that. This is an incident about changing things. The first time in this day, the former Archbishop said, well, why don't we have the first Mass in the Portuguese parish? I said, there are 2 different groups. The Portuguese are Europeans and Brazilians are Latin Americans. Well, after the Mass, it was very lively with their music. 2 older Portuguese ladies came up to me and said, our Blessed Mother doesn't like that kind of music. How do you know? It's changing things on the local scene, too.
That's a wonderful story. Sam, I told you you'd be next, but I'm actually going to move Dan Romero up. Dan has recently stepped down as conference minister in the United Church of Christ for Los Angeles and Nevada Conference. How are UCC churches dealing?
Not terribly well. I'm impressed to hear Heidi speak because I think with her leadership, she at least has presented a model for change and transformation. And for a seminary like this, it takes a leader to be able to do that. A leader like Heidi with some skill and sensitivity who's obviously prepared herself, and I commend you for that, because I see very little of it. Now, the United Church of Christ, we have about 130 plus congregations in Southern California, Nevada. And in large measure, very few of them have been dealing well with the demographic changes, largely with the huge Latino community. And one of my great disappointments as I retired after 37 years in ministry with the UCC is that the United Church of Christ as a denomination has done so little in the Latino community. It is the most underrepresented and smallest statistically group in the UCC. And I've heard every excuse imaginable of why that is impossible. 30 years ago, as a young pastor, when I was in Southern California in the local church, we were talking about the very same things we're talking about now. And immigration was also on the agenda. We were preparing for the big 187 proposition in California. The issues were the same, the arguments were the same, different faces maybe. The Latino community was growing in strength. If we had had any creativity or initiative at that time, we would have begun dealing with those issues and trying to relate more constructively with the Latino community. We simply didn't do it. So we're decades. The UCC, and I can say all I want about the UCC because I'm retired now for one minute. But we have, and you know that, those of you who know the denominational scene have historically been, I think, on the cutting edge of many social justice issues. But we have a habit often of seeing people of color as objects of mission rather than participants with us in mission. And what's happening now is the Latino community in those churches that we have now started, Latino churches, we have 24 Samoan congregations. I just wanted to throw the Pacific Island Asian American into the mix. We have Marshallese. We have a recent Indonesian congregation as well. And a huge Samoan community. Folks want to be at the table. They want to participate in shaping who we're going to be as a church into the future. And we've not created ways to do that. And the kinds of things that you hear Heidi talking about in terms of integration of worship, shared worship, liturgy that is more sensitive, our people would rather close the doors than face and confront the kind of change that is necessary to be one people of God. And we've got a long way to go. I don't want to implicate the other mainline churches because I think the Methodist, Presbyterians, and others probably have done better, but the UCC has done very poorly.
Sam Rodriguez, you're somewhat differently situated. The preceding four speakers all operate within denominational structures. Your work has been largely with I don't know if movement is the right word, but with evangelicals, without regard for a denomination. Roughly 16 million Hispanic born-again Christians in the United States. You seek to represent through your organization, I think it's 18,000 Hispanic churches. Correct. And spanning some 75 denominations, so a very different kind of phenomenon. Much of your work, as I understand it, is in the public arena, but I want to ask you more about what happens kind of locally and specifically. Here's a way to put it. Is there a difference between an Hispanic evangelical and an Anglo-evangelical?
Absolutely.
Okay. Enlighten me.
First of all, there's an inclination towards more salsa and Taco Bell. And that's the theological doctrinal side. No, that's where, in respect to the initial question of how immigration is transforming the religious landscape, let's look at Latino evangelicals. White evangelicals historically have been inclined in contextualizing the narrative of what we call piety or righteousness issues. They've stayed on the side exclusively of life issues, historically, primarily since Roe v. Wade, and then the defense of marriage issues in the past 10, 15 years. Latino evangelicals, and Luis Lugo's statistics, I don't know what Luis shared yesterday, he probably shared about the growth of the Latino evangelical community. Latino evangelicals come along and they look at the historical perspective in America and see white evangelicals have been on the side of righteousness, for lack of a better term. The African American community has been on the side of justice in this mainstream public policy and how they look at things in their prism. Latinos come along and say, we could have our cake and eat it too. So a Latino evangelical would say it's both righteousness and justice. We can't address issues of life if we don't address health care and education and poverty. It's impossible. So it's more of the nexus, the convergence of both platforms. It's a transformational missiology, beyond its personal piety, but it's corporate piety. It's the broadening of the evangelical agenda. And with these 15 million born-again Latino evangelicals, I don't know if Luis did share.
They're having trouble hearing you, so if you can use that mic.
Wow, and as a Pentecostal preacher, I've never heard that phrase before. They're having trouble hearing me. Wow. I will share with my wife and my congregation that they're interested. And with Latino evangelicals, there is 15 million strong. By the year 2025, the vast majority of evangelicals in America will be non-white. They will be Latino. So from a social political perspective, the term Christian right is repudiated by the Latino evangelical world. It's almost an anathema to the Latino evangelical world. So what you're seeing is a transformation, even of the body politic, as we attempt to contextualize the term Christianity, Christian involvement in public social policy. And it's broad, it's not limited, and it's very diverse. Doctrinally, it is the same motif, same modus operandi, same statement of faith as white evangelicals. However, there is a strong social justice component that cannot be neglected. I would consider them to be the quintessential centrists.
But let me ask this question, though. As you look down the road, given the explosion of Hispanic evangelicals, do you see parallel play, basically two bodies of people playing in the same sandbox at the same time, but separately, or do you think this portends a change for how we understand evangelicalism, period?
No, right now, presently, it's two groups playing the same sandbox simultaneously, except we're aiming towards two different directions. Again, the Latino evangelical world is looking at a broadening of the agenda, looking at issues such as torture, looking at issues, and Tyler's here, at nuclear arms reduction, nuclear proliferation, looking at global poverty. For Latino evangelicals, we were surprised. We're still kind of in a quasi-shocked state of why white evangelicals would have a problem acknowledging climate change or global warming. So there is this Latino evangelical reality that is influencing now even the white evangelical world. And at the same time, it's not an isolationist group. It's a collaboration group. So if you would hear around in Latino evangelical communities this commitment to what they call an apostolic model or partnering, the commissioning of 2 by 2 by Christ. So what they would say is a kingdom culture. In the matter of fact, you would hear Latino evangelical pastors say, we don't want a multicultural church, we want a kingdom culture church that's multi-ethnic. And it sounds like a play with semantics, but it's more about, let's talk about the kingdom culture, the culture of God's kingdom, rather than American or European interpreted descriptors of what multiculturalism may look like. So it's a broadening of the agenda. It is a viable, sustainable, transformational missiology. It has a global mindset, and that's what I believe the immigration influx is totally transforming the evangelical landscape.
Thank you.
Wow. That's great.
Alejandro, you have many tools in your kit, but one of the things that I understand you're currently involved in is pastoral care for immigrant, teaching people how to provide pastoral care to immigrants. And so I guess I want to ask you, I was teasing you earlier over breakfast as a parish priest. I'm tempted to ask you about how to deal with this and this and this issue in my congregation, But just generally, are there different pastoral issues for immigrants than for those of us who are native born? Give us a sense of what those are.
Yes, absolutely. There are. And as you were mentioning right now as a pastor, that's a regular question that I'm asked. And in the center, we receive those requests of pastors throughout the country needing help and saying, what do we do? I mean, we have all this influx of people that have arrived in very short period of time. And the answer I can give right now with some experience behind it is there's no one unique only community. There's so many different situations that you have to pick up the community where it's at. And with its resources, and from there you build. So the realities we're encountering, it's a larger church, and our bishop will just mention a few things of the documents, but just to have an idea, about 3 years ago, the Conference of Bishops of the United States, together with the Conference of Bishops of Mexico, issued a document in which they're acknowledging the reality of immigration, especially from Mexico, Central America, Latin immigration, and the need for the church to respond to that reality. And so in that document, of course, they do list a variety of issues that are involved in that. And you have the corporal issues, physical issues, that are involved in the needs of the immigrants coming into parishes with very basic needs of education, of housing, of health care, of food, of clothing. and finding a job and having some counseling because of the traumatic experience of crossing from their different countries and coming into the States, and the situations, of course, of legal aspects that they have to become aware, that they're not aware at all many times. So I traveled to Saginaw in Michigan, and I find a community there of Hispanics. It's an older community because they came in with the Bracero movement in the 50s, 60s. They're older people, Hispanic, Latinos, most of them Mexican, and they're encountering a situation in which all these young people, immigrants coming in from Central America and Mexico, and they don't know what to do with them. They don't even have a way of communicating with them, and how can they integrate in one soul community? So that's a challenge there.
So what do you do with that? That's a great example. And by the way, I've noticed several times it's not just previously white or Anglo communities that suddenly have an influx of South Asians or East Asians or people from the South, but it can also be this older Hispanic Latino community that suddenly has dealing with immigration. So that in Saginaw, that congregation, what do you do with them?
Well, in that particular case, I mean, in the process of working with that group that was concerned, is to have them have a conversation among themselves and say, what is it? What is it that you brought to this community? What is it that you're bringing to this community? The wisdom, the experience. Is that what you can offer these young people that are coming? Because most of them are very young, as we noticed in the demographics, and it's not an exception in that area, very young. You bring that experience. You bring that system of support that in our culture, Hispanic, Latino, it's very much needed in order to grow and sustain yourself. Family support, neighborhood support, your old tios and tias and abuelitas and abuelitos, and you get all that support from them, and you get your faith tradition passed on that way. So that's your role. Now invite these younger people and let them know that you'll be willing to play that role and not to impose on them anything. And so I understand that later, I mean, they did that. They started a conversation and a dialogue and constantly exchanging the needs and the exchanging of that wisdom that they both were bringing, and they're integrating. And things like that are happening in Nashville, for example, in Tennessee, another group. I come in, and the group of African Americans that are there, and with tears in their eyes telling me, we are embracing your immigrants from Latin America. We love them, and we are following our teachings of Jesus, and to embrace them and receive them. We have not yet been received from our community. We have not yet been acknowledged as people in need. But with that pain and that sorrow and that understanding, we come to these people and embrace them and bring them in. That's a situation. You go over to Georgia, and what happens there in Georgia? You have all this influx of huge poultry plants, meat processing plants, that all of a sudden, and that's where the demographics really it has a huge impact, as I've seen, where you have metropolis. I mean, you bring 50,000 people into L.A., who's going to notice it but except the parish that got it, possibly, okay? But you bring 3,000 to a population of 2,000, and you actually, and mentioning Georgia, I can mention Alabama, actually almost duplicate the amount of Roman Catholics in that area because of the influx of people coming in so rapidly. They're caught by surprise. I go to Colorado, Grand Junction, and a pastor saying, what do I do? I mean, they're telling me that I have to take care of Hispanics, but I hardly have any Hispanics here. And he says, well, why don't you offer a mass in Spanish, for example? Well, but nobody's going to be here. Well, okay, surprise. He offers the mass in Spanish, and he has the church overflowing. He needs 2, 3 services during Sunday in order to meet the demands of all the people. Those things are happening constantly. Each community needs to develop a new type, and that's the reshaping, a new type of leadership, a leadership that acknowledges our multicultural reality and embraces it, a leadership that can say, not just you are welcomed, you're welcome to your house, but how about saying you belong? So that means your ownership in your community. And so what happens then? Are you going to be invited to the council? Oh, but these people don't speak English. How can we invite them to the council? Yes, but they're adults, and they've survived a lot of things, and they've survived with their faith. They're graduated from life in many ways. Why not bring him to our council? Integrate him from that area of decision-making. And then this brings us to the roots. I'm convinced at this moment that the approach in leadership development is in the roots of the hierarchy of the church, in the roots of the people that are working and touching people and meeting people. And that's where the leadership needs to be developed. And if I may, because I'm speaking for immigrants, a very short poem that I would like to share that embraces what I've said.
You'll never get saying no to a poem.
Written in Spanish by an immigrant. And just think about the individual. Think about the community. Think about the church. Think about the world. Think about faith that is integrated into our culture, especially with Hispanic, Latinos, and other cultures. We express our faith through culture, and our faith is every day. It's not just on Sunday. We live it out with our religious tradition. It's called I Am a Tree, translated to English at the center. Beatriz Elrod, she's from Georgia, immigrant, undocumented. Now that I'm here, where I can lose my culture little by little, here where I see that slowly and cruelly others have lost it, today I feel like I can compare myself with a tree. I am able to produce fruit, flowers, oxygen, and shade. If they take some of my leaves, nothing happens. If they sever a branch, soon I will heal. If they cut my stem or trunk, it will be very difficult to survive, and possibly I will die. But if they pull out my roots, I will surely die. I am a tree. My leaves are my possessions. My branches are my home. My trunk is my family. My roots are myself. With my soul and my spirit, with my faith and my culture, I am a tree. If you plant me in another soil, in another culture, I can become strong and grow, or I can faint and die. I am a tree. If they pull out my roots, I am nothing. Is there any reference to Imago Dei?
Little theology. The floor is open for the first time. Actually, one second. Actually, we're going to get a microphone to you, I'm guessing. Because it's being recorded.
I'm usually on the end handing out the mic. This is a question for any of the panelists. I want to pick up on the issue of the comment of the leadership by the congregants, the new congregants, and how either you have or have thought about methods of basically allowing that leadership to take place, to assert itself, because the experiences here in New Haven with St. Rosa of Lima Parish is that all the creative ideas that it's being lauded for really did come from the congregation.
I can mention something about that in the sense of leadership, since I'm very much convinced about that need for development. Of course, I don't know if you're struggling in your community, for example, with a variety of cultures, and if you're struggling with a variety of languages, which is some of the elements that are very basic in coming to an understanding of leadership and the leadership from the grassroots. And again, picking up where they're at and their understanding of the community and what is community. In some cultures, relationships is life, very relational, and in others it might not be that strongly, and not that one is right or wrong, but it's just different. And some can be actually annoyed by that strong relationship and having all the kids running around and having everything, and that type of leadership, having the family integrated into the community. And the steps, if you may, to follow is first of all acknowledge that need with the people in the grassroots, in the sense of saying we are responsible individuals of this community, and we need to prepare ourselves for that responsibility, and that we then walk with the people and provide them what they need. Do they need a course in leadership? Well, that's probably it. Do they need a course or program or preparation in multiculturalism? Do they need to learn a language possibly? Well, that's what I feel that would be a step, a method of then developing your own plan, particular to your own community. And well, that's what I wanted to share.
I think if we nurtured the leadership among younger people, this is a generational thing, I think, for a lot of our churches. The world in which younger people live is obviously far more multicultural. They're far more open. And their instincts in this area are more natural. They're not forced. And if our established congregations whose leadership tend to be of older age could relinquish some of that ownership of everything they do and have in the church in terms of church life, we might see some significant transformation take place. The other thing that is happening in some communities, seminaries have been sponsoring, we call them Certificate of Ministry Studies in California through Pacific School of Religion and the Disciple Seminary Foundation, that they're offering 2-year mini theological sessions for working lay people who want a little bit more, to learn more about their faith in an academic setting. And a lot of those tend to be people of color, lay people, who will provide leadership for churches in the future. And in our system, we can license folks like that to actually be pastors in smaller congregations that are struggling. And a lot of the ethnic folk could be enormously helpful in some of the smaller congregations that are in these ethnically diverse communities, and that they could therefore provide the kind of leadership from a lay perspective.
When we were I was new in the Spanish Apostolate in 1970, 72, we had several parishes came together and got the idea of pushing the Cursillo for formation of lay leaders. And so as a result of that, through the years, a lot of the lay leaders have come from, it's a 3-day retreat, Cursillo de Cristiandad, a little course in Christianity. And also we started heavy emphasis on youth formation, the youth group. The parish I was in, there was a scrawny 16-year-old kid who is now the mayor of Hartford. He was a very poor family. The mother, they moved 13 times in 10 years with 9 kids. That's Hartford was in really bad shape. So developed leaders through the youth, and a lot of them now have taken leadership. Parish councils, we emphasize that be elected and then trained, and they took the leadership In a lot of places, it's the parish council that works with the pastor, in a collaborative way. Not that there's any clash, sometimes there is, but they usually try to work things out. And then community organizations out here, Elm City congregations organize. They're changing the thing now, but there are opportunities for leadership formation for the different churches. There are a lot of churches in it, 20 or so congregations, and been able to turn out large numbers of people for meetings. Once at St. Rose, when two drug addicts started shooting as the kids were getting out of school, and because of the organization, we turned out 450 people in the basement of the church, with the mayor, president, chief of police, and elected officials making demands on them that you couldn't have done just if you had one or two people, picking up the phone. So there are a lot of things along those lines. In Hartford, we did that. Waterbury, when I was then down here. Those are very good tools to use to form leaders. And that's the main thing, is that people sense what the problems are and come up with solutions to it, usually grabbing power because of large numbers of people.
One thing that we've done that actually involves youth and adults together is something called Amigos NPA, Friends on the Way. Lots of people were coming with different questions and needs that certainly one church could not address. And in New York City, there are many agencies and groups that might have domestic violence support, family counseling in Spanish, sensitive to immigrants, legal issues in terms of job rights, many different things. But people were not aware of where to access this help, and in many cases were afraid to try to do that in terms of what they might reveal about themselves, or if they'd be deported. So, and even although there's agencies or groups that have Spanish-speaking staff, the person who might initially answer the phone, they also have work in English. So the teenagers, so a group of people from the congregation got together, immigrants themselves, to first find out where are all these services and groups. And the teenagers made a lot of the phone calls, and then they got a huge database and have have a file cabinet with all the information, and then take turns volunteering to staff a center where people can come a certain time in the week, and then get directed to where that the church itself cannot offer this vast panoply of services, but then they can come and find out where to go. And that's completely run. So it's basically immigrants helping immigrants. And then on the next level, where there were not services, and this is where having a diverse congregation has been really helpful. One issue, for instance, women can't get gynecological care because it's not an emergency room treatment. We have a young doctor from Columbia University who's a member of the church, and actually two, and then they have been contacting friends to provide pro bono gynecological care. But that's come out of the knowing of the need, and the kind of passion to do something about it has come out of the connection on the parish level.
Other questions or comments? Yes. Tyler.
I just wanted to invite, and would be interested to hear the panel's reflections, just sort of an open invitation on the theological or spiritual realities undergirding the phenomena that you're talking about. the conversation so far feels as though we've spoken about politics and culture as if they're totalizing realities. And yet I'm assuming that underneath of that, each of us would claim that God is at work somewhere. So, I mean, if we strip xenophobia of its clothes, aren't we just looking at naked sin? Could you just take what you've talked about and if you feel so led, can't really leave church that far, talk about what you see spiritually speaking as the powers and the things that are operating underneath and in these things that you're discussing.
And I just want to, that's a great invitation, Tyler. Thank you. And not only, it's an encouragement to speak theologically about what's informing all this, but also what's growing out of it. That is, there's the theology that comes out of your experiences that may be very different than what you thought initially informed it. So anyway, all of you, any of you.
Mike?
Jump in. Anybody? Yes.
Am I right? Am I okay?
Sam. Yeah, you're on. Oh, yeah. Go ahead.
It is, and let me use a term that you may not be privy to within your own setting, but within the context of my personal experience. I think the prophetic underpinning of the influx, of this great immigrant influx, is a God-sent blessing. It is, in my opinion, an injection of a people more in the same light of an upper room experience in the book of Acts. They're gathering together from different nations to speak the language of compassion, to speak the language of the Spirit, which goes way beyond the glossolalia as interpreted by certain denominations, but rather the language of the Spirit is the language of grace and of compassion and mercy and tolerance and understanding. So prophetically, I do believe that the great immigrant influx that we're experiencing currently in our nation is actually has some spiritual underpinnings. That's why the Leviticus 19 principle and the Good Samaritan principle on how we treat those amongst us, the stranger amongst us, the aliens amongst us, I believe it is a barometer, it is a test of the spiritual union of our nation. And we are once again, as we were in the civil rights movement of the 1960s, as we were as a result of the abolitionist movement and then the subsequent Civil War, and with the women's suffrage movement, once again we are in one of those assessment times in our nation where it's not a matter of social and political assessment, but rather spiritual. And what God may be asking is, where is America today? So I think the way we respond to this issue of immigration at a local level, at a national level, speaks accolades in respect to the spiritual current state of our union and the future spiritual state of our union. Whether or not America continues to articulate a compassionate, merciful message around the world, and I know in the past few years that has been challenged and it's been difficult, but whether or not we continue to articulate a message of righteousness and justice has a lot to do with whether or not we embrace the immigrant amongst us. So I believe there's a doctrinal and a biblical impetus behind what's happening. And I want to use a word that we use a lot in my circles. If we embrace the immigrant and we embrace the different demographics, ethnic groups that are coming into this country, we're going to see great renewal, we're going to see great revival, and we're going to see a resurgence of a full gospel narrative that's full of righteousness and justice. And we're going to have a missiological church that's no longer limited to a couple of agenda items, but rather really working for the sake of the common good.
I get questions with the whole idea of welcoming. I get a lot of questions where pastors call in or members on committees of churches call me and they say, we have undocumented people in our congregation. What's our liability? And my answer to that is I turn to Presbyterians have a document called the Book of Order, which informs us as to how we should do things. And in the Book of Order is a section called inclusivity. And it says that no church can deny membership on the basis of race, ethnicity, or worldly condition. And every member should seek and look in their own hearts for a welcome, a spirit of welcomeness. And to do less is a denial of Christ himself and a scandal to the gospel. So I read that, and then I tell them, choose your liability. And I put it back on.
Just to pick up on that, the Jesus' prayer that they all should be one, I think is a very powerful one. And the fact that we are already one, and that we're spiritually united as one. The challenge that I see is that we have not had sufficient theological conversation in the broad spectrum in which we all live. And in the mainline traditions now with the liberal progressive folk who are a little bit nervous with immigrants who are more traditional. There's a huge divide growing here, and we've not found a way to have that conversation. Because out of that, I think, will grow the seeds of some transformative moments. But it just seems like the folk who've been here a while don't feel like they have anything to gain from those conversations. That spirituality from immigrants, we're supposed to help them. We're not supposed to embrace within ourselves what they might believe, the core of their spiritual life. And until we open ourselves, and I dare to use the word to be converted, to something new in that sea of theological diversity, we may not be able to answer that question, truly answer it, and become the one people that I think God calls us to be.
Yeah.
You.
No. You're going next. You've seen it twice. That's a lot for Bishop.
But no, accepting everything my wonderful colleagues have said, beautiful. For my own life, I've always used the words of Irenaeus, the glory of God is the human being fully alive. I don't know who can possibly be fully alive, but what can we do to facilitate that? So there's a lot of answers to that. The other is Zachor, remember. You were foreigners in the land of Egypt. Don't you ever treat anybody like that again. Which is so powerful. Or God gives the foreigner food and clothing and so on, and you treat the foreigner well, so on. Deuteronomy either 10 or 15, I forget what those are. But the idea that we're trying to, be open to people who are hurting. I lived in France for 4 years. I don't know if anybody else has. Also, I was undocumented. I got caught by a policeman riding my bike down the wrong way of a one-way street, and I let my visa expire. Yeah, in France. And it was 2 weeks before ordination. I thought they were going to kick me out, but the guy gave me a fine instead. So, you realize how difficult it must be for people, to come here and just to reach out in compassion. I think the Good Samaritan parable, too, is a big help, to help for us. And then to put myself in somebody else's shoes. How would I feel if I came, didn't know the language, didn't know the culture, didn't know how to access the different goods and services, And so what can I do to make that a little better for somebody else? Whatsoever you do to the least of my sisters and brothers, you do to me.
What I wanted to say is one of the gifts that the increasing number of immigrants have brought to the church, in my experience, is helping us, inviting us to re-examine and deepen our theology. For instance, in the Lutheran Church, I think the presence of, in our congregation, the presence of many persons from Mexico has called us to look at what is our theology as Lutherans of Mary. because some people will see, the image of the Guadalupe. Now, we had stained glass windows until they had to be taken out because of construction that had many images of Mary that had been there for years that nobody said, oh, why is that image of Mary in the window? But then when there was the image of the Guadalupe, it suddenly, well, isn't that Catholic? The German stained glass Mary was not Catholic. But then, actually Martin Luther's treatise on the Magnificat, it has many, many parallels with the Guadalupe story. And so it's deepened our own theological tradition. This past Lent, and although barbed wire is certainly, it's used in many things, but we had someone whose leg was ripped crossing the border. We put not real barbed wire, but it really looked like fake barbed wire, but it was quite good fake barbed wire. We put it around the altar, around the pulpits, around the baptismal font, and so it, and why is there barbed wire in the church? We put a sign up, why is there barbed wire in the church? And really used it throughout Lent to reflect on our sin and our divisions from one another, and as churches, how we fence people out, both in terms of language, in terms of sexual orientation. It took an image that came out of people's experience of immigration, but that helped us consider, a larger theological category and impact in our lives. And it was, very powerful to just see that barbed wire in the church, and then, and then actually people who were immigrants removing it at Easter.
We're going to go for another half hour or so, but let's just take 60 seconds to...
Looking back over history, we've had waves of immigration before, bigger waves, in fact. And I was sitting here, and I want to know how we dealt with it then, and is there something to learn? And I'll share with you an anecdote. My teeny tiny farmer grandmother outside of Chicago died at 97, who's my hero still. When her Polish priest was replaced by the Bishop of Chicago with a German priest reflecting these changes. I won't tell you how she said it, but she said something you wouldn't have expected out of a little lady like that. So it was happening then almost 100 years ago, and I'd like to know what we can learn from history. And I'm surely getting it, that it's about us, the ones already on the lifeboat that shouldn't be pulling up the ladder. I'm getting that loud and clear. You're doing a good job.
Well, we have a long history of working with immigrants, and they said they fixed it.
Okay.
Oh, wait a minute, or did it fall out?
No, you've got it.
Oh, okay. It's an interesting biography about Father Michael McGivney, who founded the Knights of Columbus here in New Haven, and they quote the New Haven Register saying the Irish lived in absolute squalor in this city in the 1870s, 80s, and so on. St. Francis Home for Children had 500 orphans in 1905 because men were killed on the jobs, and women worked themselves literally to death. They had no support systems, And then, of course, along come the Italians, and never the twain shall meet. One would they would never remember the immigrant experience in the north end of, or the south end of Hartford, for instance. An older woman on the parish council, the former school teacher, Irish descent, said, now the Hispanics are moving into the south end, and you should have seen it when the Italians moved in. It just keeps going on that. But yeah, well, I think little by little people do, but there's still all this prejudice around. And I don't know, I just don't know the answer to that. How you stop xenophobia? Many people do get over it, but others just... I know.
The racism, we've got to confront the racism of this, because and as a Mexican American, so much of it is aimed at the Mexican. We feel very deeply that this is toward us. Those of us who were born here, raised here, it doesn't make any difference. But when it comes to this issue of the hysteria and the hordes of people crossing the border and the reaction of church and non-church people, the racism runs deep. And we don't talk a lot about that. That's certainly one different element going on here. And the constant reinforcement from Latin America of our language and of our culture frightens people. And I think we have to acknowledge the fright. And the politicians have been very successful at using fear. And the loss of our civilization.
Yeah.
I mean, whoo! Yeah, and so I think the churches have, at least the mainline churches, have a lot of talk about racism in the past. We've had all these racism seminars and all that kind of stuff. But we're not dealing with it at that level with immigration.
Well, Dan, I'd be the last one to deny anything that you said. There was a time not that long ago, let me put it this way, it's only recently in American history that Italians have become white. So I'm serious about that. That they were racialized as well in many of the same ways, demon hordes and all that. So there is a question of whether or not we can learn from any of our history. Maybe not. Maybe we botched it then and are botching it now.
But Italians did not have Univision and Telemundo. But that's really it. See, the elephant in the room is the Latinization of America. Under the guise of border protection post 9/11, it's all about the Latinization of America. And the Chinese Exclusion Act, Japanese internment, this is cyclical. In America, every time we go through a difficult time, the scapegoating process always attacks the immigrant. It's part of the American experience, the entire story. It needs to stop. However, now, 45 million Latinos, Univision, Telemundo, the music, the food, everyone's asking, what is it to be self-defined as an American? What is the definition of an American? What makes us an American? And it's the sheer numbers now, 45 million strong, so many undocumented, 12 million, 15 million, 20 million in some projections. It's the sheer numbers that's provoking the xenophobic and nativist uprising that we're seeing. But the church should lead the way. When Senator John McCain looked at me last year, the year before last, and said, if white Christians, particularly white evangelicals, because they have more of a pull with a certain party, if they would have stood up, this would have been done 2 years ago. But there's a problem. The problem is that certain white Christians seem to adhere to Apostle Lou Dobbs and Bishop Rush Limbaugh and Prophet Sean Hannity more than they listen to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And they replace Christianity with American nativism. And the question is, are we Americans first or citizens of God's kingdom first?
Amen.
One other thing, so-called faithful American large middle class churches are immersed in the refugee model. You were talking about people as objects of mission. And this is very strong in some of our churches. Every year my church adopts a family, does everything for them, gets them an apartment, but they're not in our church and in our neighborhood. So this is a very big, message, very big model.
I want to add something to this conversation, and I believe it touches past comments in reference to many times, and I've seen it, that we've been talking about immigrants, the immigrants coming and what are the characteristics, and how are they reshaping, and why are we doing this or not? And it seems to me that our reference is, them, they. And wait a minute. When can we have a conversation of us? And when is it that we will consider an immigrant coming and belonging to the community? And if he belongs, as we say they do, because they're brothers and sisters, same creator, whatever, what happens? Are we willing to change? I mean, I'm talking about the host community or the receiving community. Are we willing to change? I come from a family of 10. In the second one, every child that was born, the whole family changed. So isn't that the same thing in our community? One person comes in. The community has changed. But wait a minute, we're going to be accommodating to all these people all the time? Yes, that's community. It's dynamic, it's alive, it's energized, it's nurtured. by the attitude, by the behavior, by the action, based on theological values, that we are created by one God, that we then are called to share lives together. And so I feel that that's crucial, and that means that our churches, and I constantly find it, what is happening to our people in the pews? We a few of us possibly, in leadership in some sort, talk and are convinced about it. But what about the people in the pews? The people in the pews don't have the slightest idea of what's happening many times. They're not getting it. What is it? Do we have to break the word open? And to be able to say the multiplication of the loaves was sharing? Can the Samaritan be the story of an immigrant coming to save a community that is wounded, that is hurting, and not the other way around? And so as we start breaking that word and bringing it to life and challenging ourselves, I feel that what you're saying is just a repetition. It'll continue. But there's hope, because there's a lot of things happening. And people that leave their countries, they leave in the name of God and with the blessing of God. And as I speak with them, what made you go through all these challenges? I mean, your friends, your brothers, your sisters abandoned you in the desert. You survived. How did you do it? God is the only one that did not abandon me, ever. God. So God is present.
I'd like to go back to the question of fear again, and our fear of the immigrant. And it does seem to me that there's another source which the church might address, which is, my great-grandfather came over during the Irish famine, so he experienced a tremendous amount of trauma before he arrived here. But that part of my family's history is a complete blank. Yeah. There's nothing said. I mean, only very recently have various members of the family been willing to even acknowledge that happened, that someone was in that kind of dire strait. So, and I this is true of my Armenian friends, this is true of so many of us, that all our families have a past that has this tremendous trauma in it, which is a source of shame. All of us are supposed to be fine. We all made it. And I think that might be a source where people could talk to each other. Yes, my family, maybe we've been here longer than your family, but my family went through trauma and we view it as shame. So, I just...
May I talk about that? It's just to mention that it's crucial, basic to integration. It's to touch your own life and share it. In our center, we have people from different cultures and different denominations, different groups. And one of the issues that comes out very much when we're talking and processing multicultural issues, that people come to learn so that they can serve other cultures. And then they become aware of their own culture. But I never knew I had a culture. I'm an American. But your roots, what are they? I'm an American. But your roots, we've never talked about them. The painful situation. A Jewish person saying in New York, gosh, now I understand my grandfather. And with tears talking, he was in that same corner as this Hispano-Latinos raising their hands to get hired. My Jewish grandfather was there. So where was my Irish, my Italian? Where was my French? Where was my English? What did they go through? And share that story and share it with the newcomers. And they'll share their story. And it's very powerful. It's an initial, a cornerstone to start integration. Tell your stories. Remember them. They're painful. They're shameful many times. At that time, that was considered that way.
Sometimes as an exercise, when I'm speaking to a large group of people, I'll make everybody stand up. And then I'll say, okay, if you immigrated, sit down. If one of your parents immigrated, sit down. And who's left standing are African Americans and some Southerners. That's it. Whoa. So then I say, well, let's talk about welcome. Let's talk about assimilation. You can't have, so there are two discussions going on. There's one with how we should be as individuals and as corporate bodies, and how we become a group, a community together. But then there's also systemic issues. And which comes first, the chicken or the egg? I don't know. But we have huge, huge systemic problems that are, and our immigration system is one of those, and I want to keep that in front of us, because we can't, we can be a very welcoming community, but if our system is so broken and dysfunctional, then we've got real problems. And look, that's why I do that little, I don't know what you call it, it's not a game, but that's why I do that, because look at African Americans in the United States today. We're still having the same issues, and African Americans have been here longer than most of us as racial or people groups. So I think there's two things going on, and we can't divorce them from each other.
When Remy spoke both times yesterday, she stood up and said that she thanked everybody for all the great work that they're doing. I just want to echo that. Really appreciate the depth and the breadth of this conversation and all the work that you are doing, and everyone in the room is along the lines of these issues. I am struck by this concept that, Alejandro, you introduced of moving from welcome to belonging, if I'm attributing it correctly to you. And to me, that's to move from invitation to ownership. And dovetailing a little on what you said, Dan, about how this could be a two-sided thing. This is not just facilitating a sense of belonging that is ownership by immigrants in the communities and churches where they settle, but also opening the minds and hearts of non-immigrants to realize it's a chance for us to find belonging within those immigrants' lives and the culture and spirituality that they bring. And I was wondering if you all could comment a little more as people of the church and as professionals in your various ways of how we make this move from invitation to belonging, and knowing that it should be and needs to be a two-sided thing, not just us to them, but them to us, and so it finally becomes a we.
And actually, I'm going to ask Heidi if you'll start, just because I'm thinking about Trinity Lutheran in Manhattan, just your recent history, and it seems to me that this question is perfectly teed up for you, among others.
Well, it does involve some of the reversals of the Magnificat. There has to, as finite people, there has to be some moving aside. There has to be some displacement or dislocation for there to be reconciliation. And of course that's not easy for people, but there isn't an easy way because of so much that is broken, and our faith tells us it's possible through Christ. But as I like to the simple example of council meetings, council leadership being, in two languages, that means that people that are used to having their dominant language rule, have to let go of that. It means, depending on the size of your building, it means shifting around in space use. It has a lot of practical ramifications. And I think to help people embrace that requires, a lot of preaching and teaching and pastoral care, the regular, work of the church.
And it's very experiential. It has to be based on building a community. You can't just go to a seminar for an hour and intellectualize at that point and expect the kinds of deep change that you're identifying. And it has to be deeply built into the core of a community. And I think we're all, regardless of our background, I belong to a Filipino church that's close to where I live. It was about 26 years ago. It's our first Filipino church, United Church of Christ in Southern California. A large, good, strong, young church. You know, what they're facing now is, how do they open the church up to non-Filipinos? They're having a big argument, which I started, I claim, I'm a member of the church, was why do we have to say we're Filipino-American in the name of our church? That's terribly exclusive. People come in from all different backgrounds and they never come back. So either we're not doing something right because they want to grow and serve the community, which is 50-60% Latino, and the rest is everything else. And this church is vibrant, has an opportunity to grow in the community. Well, they've got to examine the issue of their identity as Filipino. And that is really hard for them, because that's what they started. And you get into the age thing, the elders this, blah, 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 blah. So it's not just the white folk that are struggling with this in the world. All of us have to open to embrace that which is different, culturally, economically, and otherwise. So we're all in this together, folk. This isn't just white folk. Yeah. And I think it's exciting. It's very exciting for the purposes that you've outlined, because in the final analysis, I think we can become that community, and that's the only hope we have for this nation, it seems to me, is for the religious community to get its act together, because that's going to affect, as Sam so eloquently indicated, the future of this nation, really. So,
I'm told there are two hands that have been waving. We'll take them, and then I'll give the panelists each a chance for a final 90 seconds or so. Melissa, you've got the mic, apparently.
I just wanted to offer a caution about the idea of identification through kind of trauma. That the way that it's a great impulse to kind of say, oh, look, you know, my suffering is like yours. There is a way in which my family too. And my caution is based on some interracial work that we're trying to do here at YDS with Dr. Towns. And one of the things I think we have to talk about is white privilege. That the naming of the ways in which, even though I am from a family of immigrants, I participate and benefit from privilege. And I think that sometimes it's tempting in the church to always think of ourselves, particularly if we are in white congregations or suburban, middle-class congregations, as our already underdogs, and not to name the power that we do have, and to think about the ways in which we participate in maintaining the things that we would like to deconstruct. And lastly, I think post 9/11, that a lot of American rhetoric, we as American citizens sometimes now imagine ourselves as underdog and are less able or unwilling to name, again, the ways in which we have enormous amounts of privileges and we participate in maintaining that. And this is in part a conference that we're going to have here in the fall about, are we safe yet? Kind of, when would we know that? And so I think that some of it is, I think it's important to say, oh, look, we are immigrants too, but to say, God, I have a lot of privilege, and how do I use it? And how is it being disseminated in ways that continue to disempower others?
Wow.
It was told, where's Delphine? Oh, there, okay. And I see at least he's
As a student here at YDS, two of the areas of interest of mine are how to do outreach with victims of violence, and then also the LGBT community. How are these conversations complicated and enriched within the immigrant community?
Well, I'd like to say something about that. And certainly the white privilege aspect continues to exist in one aspect of the LGBT community, although I'm not in others. Well, our church has a shelter for homeless, gay, lesbian, transgender, bisexual, queer youth. And it has been a point, it could be a point of strangeness among immigrants and this group, but it has become a point of understanding in a lot of ways. Back when there were a lot of rallies about a year ago, immigration, there were the Spanish, main Spanish paper in New York City, on the cover, it said, "Pa fuera." It had a picture of Bush, and then it said, "Pa fuera," so it was kind of a double entendre. But "pa fuera" means get out. And it was, it was a way to talk about young people who had been told by their families to get out. And in fact, particularly in the Latino community, the idea of kicking your child out was very shocking. And so it was, but also for the gay members of the church, it was helpful to see, although there certainly is a difference of white privilege, although most of the youth in the shelter are youth of color, but in the congregation of, some connections of what it is to be, excluded and demonized and seen as changing the American way of life. I was saying to some people when we were beginning to think about opening this shelter and beginning this work, we had long conversations in our congregation and in Spanish, and some of the people were saying, well, we aren't prejudiced about this, but we want our community to grow, and maybe the people we know will might not want to come to a church that is doing this. And then one woman got up and said, well, this church, we have been, and it was using the language of welcome, but I think implied a sense of ownership. We're fully welcomed into this church, and it was interesting, she pointed to bilingual worship. She said, it's not just that we can be here, but that we are together here. And she said, and so we should be welcoming to these young people who have been kicked out. And after, I should name her, Patricia, after she said this, everybody agreed. And the first dinner the first evening meal with young people was prepared by the Mexican women, but it involves displacement on their part, because Mexicans in our community there are families of 5 living in a 5-by-6 space. This is not an exaggeration. You may wonder, how does a family of 5 live in a 5-by-6 place? Bunk beds, parents on, a single bunk bed, parents on the bottom mattress, children on the top. In fact, this one woman, Patricia, she and her husband, they have a 15-year-old daughter and a 10-year-old daughter. They live in a 5-by-6 space. There's no kitchen. The bathroom is shared with 60 people. This is in the Upper West Side of Manhattan, where a half a block away, a new building has gone up with a studio selling for $1.5 million. I forget what I was going to say.
The space in terms of
the space. Well, so obviously a family living in this tiny space can have no celebration, can have no, family event, can have no friends. How can they have a birthday party or anything, a quinceañera, but any party, any family event? So the church is a space for that. But then a family party would go late into the night. Well, what about the young people in the shelter that come in at 9 p.m.? And our space is small. So we don't have, this part of the church can be for this group and this part of the church. So it involves significant give and take and sacrifice one for the other. And that's, that's what's happening. But that combination of, I think there's been a growing understanding among both communities, and then of course there's intersection among the communities, although people wouldn't have necessarily voiced that.
What was the question again?
How is the conversation in regards to LGBT issues, victims' rights, complicated and enriched within the immigrant community? Outreach, theological discussions, how do those two, sometimes opposing worlds, come together?
I just would say one more thing. When we did the barbed wire, because the ELCA still has a very exclusionary policy in terms of partnered gay lesbian clergy. Basically it has to be under the table. So the barbed wire around the pulpit, I mean, it's very much connected.
A few years ago, the United Church of Christ, as you may know, took a position on equal rights in marriage. We lost an entire conference of churches in Puerto Rico over that action. That doesn't mean that every church in Puerto Rico wanted to leave the United Church of Christ, but a sufficient number did to pull the entire conference out of the denomination. That was enormously painful and continues to be painful. However, on the other side, the assumption that, and I'll speak on the Latino side for this, the assumption that the Latino community is nothing but homophobic is also inaccurate. And what I have found working with Latino pastors in our area is they're a little bit insulted by the denomination wanting somehow not only to categorize them as not being able to deal with the issue, but rather paternalistic that somehow we're protecting them from having to deal with the issue, assuming that they won't grow if they're identified with the UCC. And one pastor said, you have to treat us like everybody else. We want to know who the UCC is. We want to deal with the same issues. We'll make our own decisions, thank you. And you may be surprised at what those decisions are. The UCC has gone 30 years in the issue of sexuality to get to the point where they could take a position on equal marriage rights. 30 years of struggle. In come the immigrants. And again, this is the liberal group saying, well, they all have to be open and affirming if they're going to be UCC. Took us 30 years. But these folk better sign on the dotted line right away. Well, so that kind of, you talk about affecting the dynamic, that's problematic. But I do think, let's treat people like adults. Let's let them work through the issue like everyone else has had to work through the issue. And we may be surprised.
This is the last person.
Well, maybe I'm anticipating what we asked you to speak about, but I guess I am listening to this conversation and reflecting on the enormous violence that our government is perpetrating and the way we live it in our communities, and the fact that 1 in 100 among us citizens are incarcerated, that the fastest growing incarcerated population in this country is immigrant, that we have a program of removal right now by raids, by deportation, that we have a war that is being fought by communities of poor people with no other option for social mobility, has been a part of my worship this year. It's been a way of returning in a new way to faith. But I'm impatient. And I guess I'm impatient because we have, I think, at the level of leadership, beautiful examples. And our, Bishop Rosazza is one of them, to give us this beautiful language. But in our day-to-day practice of liturgy, I worship here at Yale in a community of the most well-minded people, most open people. But we let the language of liturgy go every week without talking about what is happening and what we have consented to do. And I'm struck by that. I'm struck that every week we see the repudiated body of Christ and we don't see in it the deaths and casualties that we are perpetrating, the hunger that we are exporting abroad through our policies on food, etc. And I am so grateful to hear that perhaps a new leadership is coming through the evangelical Latinos, because we are needing it. And in our communities, it is difficult to get beyond the personal spiritual growth and address a social justice agenda. And I grew up in the liberation theology vocabulary, and I wonder where it is when we need it the most, I guess.
Thank you. I think the way to handle this is I'm going to ask everybody to speak in turn, and that will be the sort of the final offering from this panel. And you can have the last word of this. Sam, so if you're okay about starting, Peter.
That was a powerful statement, Alicia. Thank you for that. And I do think, though, that our church and other churches at the national level, we do work together and do lobby together for questions like that. And the bishops of the United States opposed the war, the popes opposed the war, and so on. I don't know, just a couple of things at the local level that are rather interesting. Our parishes, we have 7 of them. St. Rose, I believe, is one of them in New Haven, and they've going along with this Justice for Immigrant program. And there's a pastor and a team, and they're encouraged to invite immigrants, documented or not, to speak of their experiences and to enlighten parishioners about the plight that they suffer, and thereby gain support for these communities. They have access to videos. They're asked to use national holidays to reflect prayerfully on various aspects of immigration, for instance, Memorial Day, to think about those undocumented men and women serving in the military with hopes of obtaining legal status. July 4th, they can think about the values we hold dear in our country, those values that attract people to come here from other lands. And as summer approaches, people can be made aware of the fact that the fruits and vegetables we enjoy are often planted and harvested by undocumented workers, and who also get meat and poultry to our tables. And this is true of the bread and wine we use for the Eucharist. And they're given also a list of do's and don'ts prepared by Clinic, Catholic Legal Immigration Network. They have a lot of good stuff. You can access that on the internet. To carry a card with emergency contacts, your lawyer's name, the name and phone number if you're a parish priest, list of your medication, and all things like that. And an initiative, I'll stop with this, the Archbishop undertook is to work with the Knights of Malta, St. Francis Hospital. So we have a van that's outfitted as a clinic, and it goes around from one Hispanic pair to the other. In Hartford, there are 7 of them. And it serves mainly an undocumented population. Doctors and nurses and interpreters from St. Francis Hospital work pro bono. And we also have, and so they're not charged anything, even for medicines. So it's a way of trying to reach out in a humane way to people who are hurting and otherwise would not have had access to medical care.
Dan?
I hope that we can be far more ecumenical in whatever it is we do. This should be obvious, but we haven't acted ecumenically in this area as much as I think we should. There's just too much at stake to be putzing around with denominational identity. I keep hearing we're in a post-denominational era. I haven't seen it yet, but I sure would like to challenge all of us to be more ecumenical. All of us. Because I think the issues that we have and we've identified here, we need to get together and really have mass momentum here. Particularly, what we heard yesterday was that the immigration laws, the future, are already being, constructed somehow. And we need to be far more active on this issue, and I think all we said contributes to that. And I'm encouraged by what I hear. I'm going to call Julie a lot. That's what I'm going to do. And I'm going to send everybody to Julie, particularly on immigration. So you better get ready for it. And I think the law, and one final thing, the legal part of this is really important. As I've traveled and spoken with church groups in particular, they do have some legitimate questions about how all of this works. They don't quite understand it, and I don't think we should jump over everybody just because they don't. But there are some things in basic immigration law and how it works that would be very helpful for people to understand so they won't get caught up in the hysteria.
Well, I'd like to say amen to that with the ecumenical. I share this sense of impatience that you mentioned. I feel that the work we do on a local level, and it matters, but it also I have a confirmation class, and they get to ask the pastor out of a box of questions, and one question one week was, what's the hardest prayer you pray? And every Sunday we actually pray every single week for the names of all the U.S. Servicemen and women who died in Iraq, and pray for all the names of the Iraqis that we don't know. And sometimes that list is very long. And I said the hardest thing that we pray for, that we pray for on Sundays, to me, is peace, because it's just one dead person after another, week after week after week, which of course is only really a tiny representation, and the war goes on, So, and I feel like with these immigration issues, I mean, to have any impact on these things, we have to be together. I mean, we're going up against such a huge force that we need to be united. And I guess I was hoping to come here and get some answers of how to impact the immigration policy of our nation going forward. And I still don't feel that I guess you're going to take care of it, maybe. but that's I still don't know the answer to that. I feel like what we do on a small level matters, but I almost have to convince myself, the small thing has the bigger impact. But certainly, I think a more broad-based coalition of voices will be louder.
Alejandro. One of the things that I want to share is that we need to leave space for God. I mean, we talk about so many things that we can do and how to do them and everything. And yes, we do have to get into action and do whatever is needed to have our communities integrate. And there's many dynamics that we can use in order to bring them together, to see what is the things that are keeping us apart, and so on and so forth. And that God that we know, and that God that we cherish, that God that we know loves us, and it's all-powerful and can transform everything if we say yes. And that yes that will take us into that conversion process. And that yes that is a constant conversion and is constantly leading us into hope and to joy and into being then a community. And building that communio, then we from there can work in solidarity. It is difficult. It's impossible in my experience. I mean, to say that we're going to integrate our communities, issues like immigration is just one of them. We focus and we stay on it because it's an economical situation that's sort of impacting our communities and as a country and the world at large. But there's many, many more. What did we do? We changed laws in reference to racism, and racism today is rampant. What do we do with the xenophobia? Well, here we are, I mean, in our churches, not outside, because we're the people that are outside, inside and outside. And what is happening with fear? Gosh, we say this country is the unchallenged power in the world. Cold War, we were fearful of communism and whatever extremists, and now we're still afraid, and even more so. So where's God in all this? Where's hope? Where's joy? Where's that love that we're called to? And so I feel that that's the focus that we need to have. I do understand that as communities we have power to challenge the debate that's taken place, to challenge the advocacy that we need to be doing. Yes. What if we changed all the laws? What if we had a reform of immigration? I do not see a change if I don't see a change in my heart. If my heart is not transformed, it's just a repetition. I'll find other ways of being fearful of or whatever. And just to say something that I learned very much, and I guess those of us that have been involved with marketing, just to finish, we're taught very much, it's a very little cliche phrase, and say, think locally, act globally. Have you heard that little thing? I propose that we think globally and act locally. The other way around. That's Catholic, that's church, that's universal community. And have prayer. Prayer, I mean, as you see Jesus in the Gospels, and gosh, 20-something or 30-something times he goes out to pray, and not to a temple or a church. He goes out to the mountain. Can't we pray and keep connected with God and then come and join in the community and stay connected?
Thank you. Julia?
The United States right now is made up of about 15% of people who care about what's happening with immigration. They care about, if they're in churches, they care about becoming a multicultural church or a multicultural community. Then there's another 15% that is adamantly opposed to any change in American culture, rejects immigration to the United States in various levels, and then the rest is all on this continuum. And I can be a little bit more singular focused. I was hired to do all things immigration for one denomination. So I keep that focus. And so what drives me, what gets me up in the morning and keeps me going, is that I want the Presbyterian Church to be to immigration reform and to the immigration situation today in my time what the Quakers were to the abolitionist movement. And I don't know if it's going to take faith communities together, which is what happened kind of with slavery, or do we need a Moses? Or do we need a Martin Luther King? Do we need one person who can be the strong voice? I don't know. But I'm not as eloquent, really, as any of my brothers and sisters on this panel. I'm very practical. And we need resources into our churches to help them deal with these issues. We need Bible studies. We need things. I've created something called the Family Care Plan. How do churches work with their undocumented church members? What can they do when there's no hope for them under the law? So doing those things and then creating resources for that vast majority of people who are confused, who don't know what to think, who may or may not have relationships, when they need that personal connection. How do we as church do that? And that needs to happen within our own churches and ecumenically. And then to have the eloquence here being the prophetic voice to these churches to inspire them to do some of the Bible study and the research on their own, and mission together. I often tell people, okay, do something multicultural in your church, but you cannot use costumes, food, music, worship. Now do something. What's left? They have to do something together. And they have to join together and be partners. So that's it has to happen in our churches, and we need resources, and we need then God can work in the hearts and minds, and that's what's going to change things. That only the hearts and minds changed for the majority of people who are in our communities.
As a good evangelical preacher, I have 4 points to be shared in 2 minutes. All of them beginning with the same letter. It's part of our DNA. One, let us partner. Recently, we had a great meeting. We meaning the nation's Latino megachurch pastors and the heads of the largest Hispanic denominations sat across the table with the most prominent African-American pastors in America to discuss the black-brown divide, to discuss immigration and partnering for renewal in our urban centers. Let's partner. Let's build bridges and not walls. Second, let us preach. We must use the power of the pulpit. The church is, according to Dr. King and others before and others after, it must continue to be the moral conscience of this nation, and we must use the power of the pulpit for the common good. Third, let us participate in the electoral process. This is going to be a little bit more, I'm not going to disguise this at all. We must use the electoral process to identify those representatives, those members of Congress that really resonate with or are adhering to a xenophobic and nativist threat, and we must repudiate, cast out, vote out. We must demonstrate to our federal government that this nation will not embrace in the 21st century or continue to embrace the xenophobic and nativist threat. And fourth point that someone else alluded to previously, let us pray. We must, this cause of embracing the immigrant amongst us, of bringing people together, of unity, it cannot be accomplished without a canopy of prayer. There must be a prayer movement that accompanies this movement. And we must pray. We must pray a simple prayer. We prayed it this morning. Thy kingdom come. Thine will be done. Remembering that the kingdom of God is not Catholic, mainline, or evangelical. And it's not Republican or Democrat, red state or blue state. That it's, at the end of the day, righteousness, peace, and joy in the Holy Spirit.
Amen. Thank you. Want to know?